In the year 1362, a small village nestled in a snow-covered valley simply ceased to be found. Not destroyed, abandoned. The people who lived there walked away into winter, leaving behind the rhythm of ordinary lives. This is the story of one woman who remained behind, tending the last fires, waiting through the deep cold for what might come next. Good evening and welcome. I am grateful you are here tonight. We journey to a remote Alpine village in the mountains of Switzerland, where we will follow Margaret, a healer and keeper of the village's oldest traditions, through the quiet days of an endless winter. Let the concerns of your day fade away. This story asks nothing of you but to listen and rest. Margaret, 32 years old, moved through the stone cottage with work-reddened hands, her dark hair bound beneath a linen coif. The air hung thick with the scent of dried herbs, sage and thyme and yarrow, gathered during the brief summer and now hanging in careful bundles from the cottage beams. Outside, snow continued its patient work, covering everything with silence. The village had grown quieter each day. First, the merchants' families departed when the autumn roads became treacherous. Then the younger craftspeople began slipping away in small groups, following relatives to the larger towns in the valleys below. Margaret had watched without judgment, understanding that the high mountain winters demanded sacrifice, and not everyone possessed the patience for such long darkness. Her hands, steady and practiced, arranged dried mushrooms into neat rows on a wooden shelf. Each one had been gathered in the brief summer months, each one preserved with the care that came from knowing winter's length. The work required attention without urgency, the same gentle focus that had defined her life. She moved with the unhurried rhythm of someone who had learned that winter could not be rushed, only endured with grace. The stone walls of the cottage held their warmth from the fire that had burned continuously for 3 days. Margaret fed it carefully, never frantically, never with anxiety, adding dry birch logs that she had split and stacked in autumn. The wood smelled clean and pale, and the fire's warmth spread through the room like honey dissolving in warm water. By afternoon, when the winter light had softened to pale amber, Margaret began preparing the evening meal. A small pot of barley porridge simmered above the flames, and the scent of it mingled with the herbs overhead, creating an atmosphere so deeply familiar that it seemed to slow time itself. She stirred the pot with a wooden spoon, the same spoon her mother had used, the same spoon her grandmother had carved from pale wood decades before. The cottage settled around her with small sounds, the crackle of the fire, the whisper of wind against the thick stone walls, the distant settling of snow on the roof. Margaret paused in her work and simply listened, her hands at rest on the edge of the cooking pot. This was the peace she had discovered over her 32 years, the understanding that silence was not empty, but full of the world's quiet presence. As darkness came, and it came early in these mountains, dropping like a heavy blanket over the valley, Margaret lit 3 candles from the fire. They were precious, made from rendered tallow, and she had measured out exactly enough to last the winter if she used them wisely. The candlelight created small circles of amber warmth in the room, and she positioned them carefully, one by her sleeping bench, one by the shelves where her medicines waited, one by the window where she could look out at the snow. She had asked the departing villagers if she should leave, if she should join her sister in the lower valleys where the winters were shorter and the community larger. Each time, her answer had come from somewhere deep and certain. She belonged to these mountains, to this village, to the rhythm of seasons that demanded stillness and observation in equal measure. The others would return, or they would not. Either way, the mountains would continue their patient work, and Margaret would continue hers. The porridge was ready. She ladled a portion into a ceramic bowl, the clay warm against her palms, and settled onto the bench nearest the fire. The spoon moved slowly to her mouth, and she tasted barley, salt, and the faint warmth of herbs she had added at summer's end. Each spoonful seemed to carry the entire year within it, the memory of fields, of sunshine, of hands moving through growth and harvest. Outside, the snow fell in the profound silence of high winter. The village around her, the baker's house with its cold ovens, the smith's workshop where tools hung unused, the small market square where no merchants called any more, all of it lay beneath white stillness. The empty cottages held their cold, their silence, their patient waiting. Margaret finished her meal and set the bowl aside. She would clean it later or perhaps in the morning. Time had taken on a different quality here, unmoored from the urgent schedules of lower villages. There was no need to hurry. The mountains did not rush. The snow did not rush. And so Margaret, 32 years old, had learned not to rush either. She moved to the window and looked out at the valley below, where darkness had gathered completely. Somewhere in that darkness were the paths the others had taken, the roads that descended toward warmth and people and the constant motion of living communities. But here, in this high place, there was only the patient presence of winter itself. The fire crackled softly. A log settled deeper into the coals, releasing a small shower of sparks that glowed like tiny stars before fading. Margaret watched the fire with the contentment that came from knowing she had done this work, tended this flame, prepared this food, arranged these medicines countless times before. Her hands knew what to do. Her body understood the rhythm. There was peace in such knowing. She reached up and touched the dried bundles of herbs hanging above her, running her fingers gently across the familiar shapes. Sage for the throat, thyme for the chest, yarrow for the fevers that sometimes came with deep winter. All of it preserved, waiting, held in readiness for anyone who might need it. This was her purpose in the village now, to keep these medicines, to maintain the cottage, to be present as a keeper of healing knowledge. The candles glowed steadily. Outside, the wind had gentled and the snow fell more slowly, as if the mountains themselves were settling into sleep. Margaret moved toward her sleeping bench, where a thick quilt of wool, dyed deep blue years ago, waited to receive her. She had spun some of this wool herself, her hands becoming more patient with each repetition, learning to feel the fibers, to sense when the thread was right. She lay beneath the quilt and felt its weight, its comfort, its absolute reliability. Above her, the cottage rafters disappeared into shadow, but she knew every beam, every corner, every place where the roof met the walls. She had lived in this place for 12 winters, and it had become as much a part of her as her own bones. Sleep was coming gently, the way it always came to those who had done honest work and made peace with the quiet. Her breathing slowed, matching the rhythm of the dying fire, and her thoughts grew soft and undefined. Outside, The mountains held their vigil, patient and eternal, and within their embrace, Margaret rested. Margaret woke to a sound that was not wind. It was subtle, the creak of wood under weight, the careful placement of a foot on the stone step outside her cottage. She lay still beneath her quilt, listening with the awareness that came naturally to those who lived alone in remote places. Her dark hair spilled across the pillow, and her work-reddened hands remained folded at her chest. The sound came again. Someone was approaching the cottage. She rose without hurrying, moving her body gradually from the warmth of her quilt into the cold air of the room. The fire had burned down to glowing coals, and the candles had exhausted themselves during the night. Only the faint gray light of pre-dawn seeped through the window, enough to see the shapes of her familiar room. The shelves, the hanging herbs, the cooking pot waiting by the hearth. Margaret, 32 years old, pulled her cloak around her shoulders and moved toward the door. Her breathing remained steady, her movements deliberate. In these mountains, visitors in deep winter were rare, but they were not unknown. Someone might be lost. Someone might be seeking shelter. Someone might be in need of the medicine she kept. She opened the door to find an old man standing in the snow, his shoulders rounded under a cloak that had once been fine wool, but was now tattered at the edges. His face was weathered and creased like ancient leather left in the sun, and his eyes, when they met hers, held a peculiar mixture of exhaustion and recognition. "I knew someone would remain," he said, his voice rough from disuse or cold or both. "I told them someone would stay." Margaret stepped aside without question. The old man entered the cottage, bringing with him the sharp clarity of winter air and the scent of distant smoke. She closed the door behind him, and the warmth of her carefully maintained fire seemed to gather around them both like an embrace. "Sit," Margaret said, gesturing toward the bench near the hearth. Her voice carried the calm of someone accustomed to giving comfort. "You are cold." The old man settled onto the bench with the careful movements of someone whose joints had learned to speak in the language of pain. Margaret moved to rebuild the fire, adding dry birch logs with the same patience she brought to all her tasks. The flames rose gradually, and the light expanded through the cottage, pushing back the shadows of early morning. "I am Oswin," the old man said. His hands trembled slightly as he held them toward the growing flames. "I was the village elder. I helped decide. I helped guide them away." Margaret prepared tea without responding immediately. She had learned long ago that some stories required silence first, acceptance before questions. She heated water in a small iron pot, adding dried mint leaves and a touch of honey she had carefully rationed through the winter. The steam rose and filled the small space with fragrance. They believed the village could not survive another winter like the last, Oswin continued, speaking as if the words had been waiting inside him for months, pressing to be released. The harvest had failed. The snow had come early. Children were hungry and parents were afraid. Margaret handed him the cup, watching as his weathered hands wrapped around the warmth. He drank deeply, and she saw something in his face ease slightly. Not peace, but perhaps the smallest relief that he was no longer entirely alone with what he carried. "How many departed?" Margaret asked, though she thought she already knew. The village had grown progressively quieter, inhabitants slipping away in small groups through the autumn months. 417, Oswin said quietly. We counted them as they left. 417 souls, walking down the mountain paths toward the valleys where there was food and warmth and the company of larger settlements. I was supposed to go with them. He paused, drinking more tea, and Margaret observed how the warmth seemed to restore something in him, color returning to his face, his hands growing steadier. She had seen this before, the way that simple comfort could bring a person back from the edge of despair. But you did not leave, Margaret said. It was not a question. No, Oswin replied. As the last group departed, I turned back. I climbed the mountain again and I came here. I walked through the empty village, all those cottages with their doors standing open, all those hearths grown cold, and I realized I could not bear to be anywhere else. This village is my entire life. Every stone, every path, every corner holds the memory of people I have loved and lost over 73 years old. Margaret settled herself on the opposite bench, her work-reddened hands folded in her lap. She waited, understanding that Oswin's story was still unfolding, that there was more weight he needed to set down. I have been living in the old stone house near the center of the village, Oswin continued, surviving as best I could, but the cold, the solitude, I was beginning to lose the thread of myself. I would forget days. I would sit for hours without moving, without thinking. And then this morning I woke up and thought, Margaret, the healer stayed. I remembered you and I came here. Outside the cottage, the winter morning was continuing its slow arrival. The snow had stopped falling, and a faint luminescence was beginning to touch the eastern mountains, the promise of dawn. Inside, the fire had grown strong again, and the scent of mint tea lingered in the warm air. You did well to come, Margaret said, and her voice carried the weight of genuine welcome. The journey from the village center in this cold would have been difficult. It was, Oswin admitted. I was not certain I would make it, but something pulled me forward, some memory of your kindness perhaps, or simply the knowledge that another living soul was nearby. Margaret rose and moved to her shelves of preserved medicines. Her fingers moved with practiced certainty, selecting a bundle of dried yarrow, another of chamomile. She selected as well a small jar of honey mixed with ground ginger, a preparation she made each autumn for those whose joints ached in the deep cold. You will stay here, she said, not as a question but as a simple statement of fact. There is space, and there is enough food if we are careful. The medicines are here if you need them. Oswin looked at her and something like tears, or perhaps just the glisten of warming eyes, touched the corners of his gaze. You would take in an old man you barely know. The others all left. They all walked away. They did what they needed to do, Margaret replied. Her dark hair, bound beneath her linen coif, caught the firelight as she moved. And we are doing what we need to do. We are staying. We are tending the fire. We are keeping the knowledge that a place existed here, that people lived here, that life continued in this high village through all the winters it has endured. She prepared a sleeping space for Oswin in the corner opposite her own bench, arranging blankets and quilts in a nest of warmth. The old man watched her with an expression of wonder, as if he had forgotten such simple kindness was possible. When she had finished, she helped him to the makeshift bed, and he lay down with the grateful sigh of someone who had been carrying weight far too long. "Rest now," Margaret said, her voice gentle and certain. "The morning is still young. There is time." Oswin's eyes closed, and within moments, his breathing had deepened into the rhythm of sleep. Margaret returned to her fire and sat quietly, watching the flames. The cottage held both of them now, two people who had chosen to remain, who had decided that some places and some stories were worth staying for, even when the world moved on. She thought of the 417 who had departed, walking down the mountain paths toward warmth and community and the promise of survival. She held no judgment toward them. The mountains demanded much, and not everyone was equipped to answer that demand. But she and Oswin had answered differently. They had said yes to the silence, yes to the cold, yes to the particular kind of courage required to remain. The morning light continued its gradual arrival. The mountains beyond the window began to emerge from darkness, their snow-covered slopes glowing with the faintest suggestion of gold. Margaret prepared a simple breakfast, bread she had baked days before, now slightly hardened but still nourishing, and a small portion of cheese. When Oswin woke, hours later, she would offer it to him. They would eat together, and the day would continue its slow unfolding. For now, she sat with the fire and the sound of an old man's peaceful breathing, and she felt, in the deepest part of herself, the rightness of this moment. The village was no longer empty. Two people remained, and that mattered. That would always matter. The snow lay thick and silent over the valley. The mountains held their patient vigil, and in the small stone cottage, Margaret, 32 years old, kept the fire burning and waited for the day to fully arrive. Oswin woke in the early afternoon, when the light through the cottage window had shifted to a clearer, colder quality. He lay still for a moment, orienting himself to the unfamiliar space, then slowly pushed himself upright. His 73-year-old body moved with the careful deliberation of joints that had learned to speak in the language of pain. Margaret was at her work table, grinding dried herbs with a smooth stone pestle. She worked with the rhythm of someone performing a task she had completed 1,000 times before, and the soft, repetitive sound seemed to anchor the quiet of the cottage. She glanced up, and a slight smile, barely perceptible but genuine, acknowledged his waking. "There is bread and cheese when you are ready," she said, "and tea, the mint from last summer." Oswin made his way to the bench near the fire, where Margaret had already placed a cup of steaming tea. The warmth of it seeped into his hands, and he drank slowly, tasting the bright clarity of the herb and the sweetness of honey. Outside, the wind had begun to pick up, and it moved across the snow with a sound like the whisper of many voices. "Tell me about the village," Margaret said, continuing her work with the pestle. "Before the departure, what was it like in the years when it was fuller?" Oswin settled back, cradling his cup. The question seemed to invite him to remember rather than to mourn, and something in his expression shifted toward a kind of gentle nostalgia. "There were celebrations," he said. His voice had grown stronger from sleep and warmth. "In summer, when the passes were clear, we could trade with the villages below. Merchants would come with cloth and tools and salt from the lowlands. We would offer them cheese and herbs and the fine wool we raised. There was music sometimes. A traveling musician might pass through, or someone's son would bring a pipe from the city. He paused, and Margaret's hands continued their steady work, crushing the dried leaves into finer and finer powder. The scent that rose from her work was complex, multiple herbs combining into something greater than any single element. My wife was the baker, Oswin continued. Elena. She could make bread that tasted like it held the entire summer within it, the grain, the salt, the care of her hands. She died 15 winters ago, and I never remarried. But I remember watching her work the same way you work now. There was a kind of meditation in it, a peace. Margaret set down her pestle and moved to her shelves. She selected a large ceramic jar and began transferring the ground herb mixture into it with a wooden spoon. The work was methodical, unhurried, each motion flowing into the next as naturally as water finding its course. I remember Elena, Margaret said. Her dark hair caught the firelight as she worked. She gave me a loaf once when my mother was ill. She would not accept payment. She said healing people was its own kind of baking, requiring patience and the right proportions and trust in the work. Oswin's eyes glistened. She would have liked you. She did like you, I think, though she never said so directly. That was Elena's way. She showed favor through action rather than words. The afternoon deepened around them. Margaret prepared the evening meal, adding barley and dried vegetables to a pot of water that she had heated over the fire. The scent that rose was complex and sustaining, and Oswin watched her work with an expression of gratitude that seemed to encompass more than just the promise of food. As she cooked, Margaret spoke about her own history in the village. She had come as a young woman of 20, sent from a lower valley to apprentice with the previous healer, an ancient woman named Catherine who had tended the village for more than 50 years. Catherine had taught her the properties of every plant that grew in the mountains, the precise drying and storage techniques, the ways of listening to a patient's body and understanding what it needed. She died 7 winters ago, Margaret said, stirring the pot with a wooden spoon. The winter was mild that year, but her body simply decided it was time to stop working. She lay in her bed, my bed now, and she asked me to promise I would stay. She said the mountains needed a keeper, someone who would remember the old ways. And you promised, Oswin said. It was not a question. I promised, Margaret confirmed. I was 25 years old, and I understood that I was making a choice that would shape my entire life. I accepted it without hesitation. She ladled the soup into 2 bowls, and they settled across from each other with their meals. The warmth of the food seemed to settle into their bones, and they ate in companionable silence, the sound of spoons against ceramic bowls marking a rhythm as old as civilization itself. When they finished, the light outside had begun its descent toward dusk. Margaret cleared the bowls and set them aside to clean later. She moved to the window and looked out at the village beyond, the roof lines visible in the gathering darkness, the paths between cottages marked faintly by the packed snow of previous journeys. Tomorrow, she said, speaking to the window but clearly including Oswin in her thoughts, we should walk through the village. You know every house, every family that lived in each one. It might be good to remember them, not with sadness but with gratitude for the time they inhabited this place. Oswin came to stand beside her, his 73-year-old frame moving with slightly more ease than it had that morning. Together, they looked out at the empty village, and the silence between them was not empty at all, but full of memory and presence and the decision to witness what had been. "The baker's house still has bread in the oven," Oswin said quietly. "I burned it the morning we left. I meant to let it finish, but I became confused about whether I was going or staying, and I simply walked away from it." "We can retrieve it tomorrow," Margaret said. Her voice carried no judgment, only practical acceptance. "The cold will have preserved it. We can break it apart and feed it to the birds or grind it for use in other cooking. Nothing is wasted in a place like this." As darkness fell completely, Margaret lit the candles again, carefully allocating them from her stored supply. She had rationed precisely, and she would continue to ration precisely now that there were two of them. The mathematics of survival in the mountains was not complicated, but it required attention and intention. Oswin helped her prepare the cottage for sleep, and she showed him where extra quilts were stored, how the draft from the door could be minimized by placing rolled cloth along the threshold. These were the small skills of survival that seemed obvious once learned, but had to be taught with patience to someone new to them. As they settled toward sleep, Margaret spoke one more time. "The village will come alive again in our caring for it," she said. Her work-reddened hands folded at her chest as she lay beneath her quilt. "Not with 400 people, perhaps, but with attention and memory and the knowledge that this place matters. That matters, Oswin. What we do here matters." In the corner, the old man lay in his nest of quilts, and his breathing gradually deepened into sleep. The fire burned steadily and tended carefully to last through the long night. Outside, the mountains held the village in their eternal embrace, and within that embrace, two people rested, two people who had chosen to remember to remain, to keep the fire burning through the darkness. The night stretched long and quiet. The snow continued its patient work, covering the empty cottages, marking the paths with its white silence. And in the small stone cottage where herbs hung from the beams and medicines waited on shelves, Margaret and Oswin slept the sleep of those who had made peace with their choices. Morning arrived with a clarity that seemed to sharpen every edge of the mountains. The snow had stopped falling in the night, and the air held that particular quality of winter silence that comes after fresh snow. A silence so complete it seemed almost solid. Margaret woke to find the cottage cold enough that her breath formed small clouds, and she moved quickly to rebuild the fire from the coals she had carefully banked. Oswin stirred as the flames began to rise, casting new warmth through the small space. Margaret, 32 years old, had already prepared hot water for washing, and she handed him a cloth dampened with warmth so he could tend to his face and hands. These small courtesies seemed to matter enormously to the old man, the simple dignity of beginning a day with cleanliness. "Today we walked," Margaret said. It was not a suggestion but a gentle statement of intention. "The village needs to be seen. The cottages need witnesses." They dressed carefully, wrapping themselves in layers of wool and linen, securing their cloaks against the wind that still moved through the valley. Margaret packed a small bag with bread, cheese, and a flask of warm herb tea. These small provisions would sustain them through several hours away from the cottage. The walk to the village center took perhaps 20 minutes, though Oswin's pace was careful and measured. His 73-year-old legs moved with the deliberation of someone who had learned that haste brought only pain. Margaret walked beside him without rushing, matching her stride to his, and the quiet between them seemed to deepen their connection rather than strain it. The village revealed itself gradually as they descended the gentle slope from her cottage. The first buildings they encountered were the workshops, the smith's forge with its anvil visible through the open window, the carpenter's shed where tools still hung in neat rows, the weaver's cottage where frames stood ready for thread that would never be threaded. "Thomas the smith," Oswin said, pausing to look through the window. "He was the best craftsman in the Three Valleys, made horseshoes that never broke, tools that held their edge longer than any others. He had 3 children, all of them went with him to the city. He wanted to establish a smithy there, work with finer materials." Margaret observed the silent space with her work-reddened hands folded before her. She did not speak, understanding that Oswin needed to voice these memories, to give them shape and sound before they became only ghosts. They moved deeper into the village, and the residential cottages began to emerge from the snow. Each one held its particular story. The house where the baker Elena had lived and worked, its kitchen still arranged as if she might return at any moment. The schoolmaster's cottage where children had once gathered to learn letters and counting. The midwife's house where generations had entered the world. At the baker's cottage, Oswin paused. The door stood partially open, and through it they could see the kitchen table, the large oven, and on a shelf, a small wooden figure, a child's toy perhaps carved with care. "My grandson carved that," Oswin said quietly. "He was 9 years old. He wanted to be a woodworker like a carpenter. His father took him to the city to study with masters there. I have not seen him since last spring." Margaret entered the cottage with quiet respect, her movements careful and reverent. The oven indeed held the remains of bread, blackened now, hardened but still bearing the shape of Elena's careful shaping. Margaret removed it gently, feeling its weight, understanding what Oswin had carried with him through all these months, the knowledge that he had abandoned this task in confusion, that this bread had been left to burn. "She would not have minded," Margaret said, and her voice held absolute certainty. "Elena would have understood that the confusion of departure cannot be blamed on any individual person. The bread served its purpose. It was made with care. It was left in the fire, and it became part of the village's final days. That is enough." They continued their slow walk through the village, and Oswin became the guide, pointing out details that only a long-time resident would know. The path where children played games in summer, the large stone where the entire village had gathered for celebrations, the well where every person drew water, where conversations happened in the daily ritual of survival. At the center of the village stood the small stone church, its bell tower reaching toward the sky. The door opened easily to their push, and they stepped into an interior that was almost shockingly peaceful. The altar remained adorned with dried flowers from last summer. Someone, perhaps Oswin himself, had tended to even this small beauty before the departure. "We had a priest until 5 years ago," Oswin said, his voice carrying across the quiet space. "He became ill and had to return to the city for healing. A bishop came and said the village was too small to maintain a priest, but he blessed the church and said we could maintain it ourselves. We did. Even as everything else was preparing to leave, we kept the church tended." Margaret moved through the space with reverence, understanding that she was walking through a history that had shaped generations. She placed her hand on the stone altar, and the coolness of it seemed to connect her to everyone who had ever stood in this place, every person who had come seeking solace, seeking connection to something larger than themselves. They sat on one of the wooden benches, and the silence here seemed different from the silence outside, not empty, but full of presence, full of prayer that had been spoken in this space across centuries. "Why did you think I would still be here?" Margaret asked. It was a question she had not asked the day before, and now seemed the right time. Oswin was quiet for a long moment. "Because I remembered your eyes," he finally said. "When I was the elder and making decisions about the village's future, I would sometimes see you gathering herbs in the summer or tending to someone who was ill. Your eyes held something that most people did not, a kind of rootedness, a commitment to being present. I thought, if anyone remains, it will be Margaret, and I was right." They emerged from the church into the afternoon light, and the shadows on the snow had begun to lengthen. The day was moving toward its conclusion, and the cold was intensifying as the sun descended. Margaret and Oswin made their way back toward her cottage, taking a slightly different path that led past the community storage buildings where grain and preserved foods had once been kept before distribution. The buildings were largely empty now, the provisions taken by those who departed. But in one corner, Margaret discovered something, a small cache of apples, wrapped individually in straw and stored in a cool corner. They had survived the months, preserved by the cold and careful storage. "These must have been forgotten," Oswin said. His 73-year-old hands reached out carefully, and he selected one apple, unwrapping it to reveal fruit that was still firm, still fragrant with the memory of autumn orchards. "Nothing is forgotten," Margaret replied. "It was preserved. Now it will nourish us. That is what preservation is, holding something through time so that it can serve a purpose when the time is right." They gathered several of the apples, wrapping them carefully in cloth. As they walked back toward the cottage, the wind had begun to pick up again, and the first flakes of new snow were beginning to fall. It was the kind of snow that comes with evening, gentle, steady, promising more accumulation through the night. By the time they reached Margaret's cottage, darkness had nearly arrived. The fire was burning low, but the coals held enough heat to allow quick revival. Margaret fed the flames while Oswin settled onto his bench, and the warmth gradually returned to the small space. That evening, Margaret prepared something special, a stew made from the dried vegetables and barley, but also incorporating one of the forgotten apples, cut into small pieces. The sweetness of the apple mingled with the savory vegetables, creating a complexity of flavor that seemed almost luxurious after months of simple sustenance. "I have not tasted an apple since summer," Oswin said, His weathered face showed something like wonder as he ate. "I had forgotten how they taste, how they make you remember entire seasons." Margaret ate slowly, savoring each spoonful. Her work-reddened hands held the spoon with the same careful attention she brought to all her tasks. She was thinking about memory, about how objects and flavors and places held the history of people within them, about how important it was to witness those histories, to acknowledge them, to let them shape the present moment. After they had eaten and cleaned their bowls, Margaret brought out her small collection of stored supplies and began organizing them more carefully now that there were 2 people to sustain. She laid out the quantities she had gathered through the year, the grains, the preserved vegetables, the herbs, the cheese that had been made in the late spring before the shepherds departed. "We have enough," she said, speaking with the certainty of someone who had calculated these matters precisely. "If we are careful and continue to gather what the mountains offer, we can survive another winter, perhaps 2 winters, and by then the world may have shifted again." Oswin watched her work, and his expression held something between gratitude and relief, as if the simple act of being present with another person, of sharing meals and memories and the careful work of survival, had restored something essential within him. As they prepared for sleep, Margaret showed Oswin how she managed the fire through the night, banking it carefully so it would burn slowly without depleting their wood supply too quickly. He watched with attention, understanding that these were skills he would need to learn, knowledge he would need to carry forward. "In the spring," Oswin said, as they settled toward sleep, "when the snow begins to melt, we should repair the cottages that are most damaged. We should prepare them as if others might return. We should keep the village ready." "Yes," Margaret agreed. Her dark hair spread across her pillow, and her voice carried the calm of someone at peace with difficult truths. "We will keep it ready. We will tend to it. We will remember the village." Outside, the snow continued its patient work, covering the empty cottages, marking the paths with white silence. The mountains held their vigil over the high place where 2 people had chosen to remain, had chosen to witness, had chosen to keep the fire burning through the darkness that surrounded them. In the morning, there would be more work, more walking through the village, more gathering of memories, more preparation for a future that neither of them could quite imagine. But both of them were determined to meet with intention and presence. For now, in the small stone cottage where herbs hung from the beams and medicines waited on shelves, Margaret and Oswin rested, and the fire burned steadily through the long mountain night. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm as natural and inevitable as the turning of seasons themselves. Margaret, 32 years old, and Oswin, 73 years old, developed a pattern of shared work that seemed to ease both of their lives in ways neither could have anticipated. The mornings began the same way. Margaret would rebuild the fire from banked coals, and Oswin would prepare water for washing. They had discovered that this division of labor suited them both. Margaret's work-reddened hands moved most efficiently with the precise tasks of medicine-making and cooking, while Oswin's knowledge of the village and its history became their constant reference point. After a breakfast of bread and cheese, they would venture into the village on most days when the weather permitted. The walks had become Margaret's way of truly learning her home, not just the cottage she inhabited, but the entire settlement that surrounded it. Oswin guided her through each building with the patience of a man who understood that bearing witness required time and attention. One morning, as pale winter light filtered through the cottage window, Oswin showed Margaret a leather-bound book he had brought from his house in the village center. His hands trembled slightly as he opened it, revealing page after page of careful handwriting, records of births, deaths, marriages, celebrations, disputes resolved. "The village record," he said. His voice carried the weight of responsibility. "Every elder maintains it, passing it forward to the next. I have been keeping these records for 42 years. I cannot let this knowledge simply disappear." Margaret received the book with reverence, understanding immediately what it meant. She placed it on the highest shelf in her cottage, where it would be protected from moisture and accident, where it could be consulted and preserved for whatever future might come. "We should add to it," she said, her dark hair catching the firelight as she turned to face Oswin. "We should record what is happening now, that 2 people remained, that the village is being tended, that the knowledge is not lost." Oswin nodded, and that afternoon, while Margaret worked on preparing a poultice for the inflammation in his aging joints, he sat at the work table and wrote. His handwriting was less steady than it had been in earlier years, but it remained legible, and his words held the authority of someone recording truth. The days grew colder as winter deepened. The snow accumulated in steady layers, and the mountains seemed to draw closer, their white slopes dominating the entire visible world. But within the cottage, the fire held strong, and Margaret's careful management of resources meant they never lacked for warmth or light or sustenance. She had begun to teach Oswin the knowledge of herbs, showing him which plants could be used for which purposes, how to recognize illness in its early stages, and what remedies might ease discomfort. His 73-year-old mind, though sometimes slow to retain information, held onto practical knowledge with remarkable tenacity. He learned to distinguish between yarrow and feverfew by touch alone, to recognize the particular scent that indicated when a dried herb had begun to lose its potency. One afternoon, as they worked together grinding dried roots for a winter tea, Oswin spoke about his years as an elder. "The hardest decision I ever made was not to stop the departure," he said. His hands moved slowly through the grinding work, matching the rhythm Margaret had established. "It was to let it happen, to acknowledge that I could not keep 400 people in a place where survival was uncertain. That required a kind of surrender I did not know I possessed." Margaret listened while continuing her work, understanding that Oswin needed to voice these reflections, to process them through conversation and memory. Her patient silence seemed to invite his words. "I told myself it was practical," he continued, "that the people would be better served in the larger settlements, that they would find work and community and the promise of easier lives. And all of that was true. But what I did not account for, what I could not have anticipated, was how much I myself needed to stay, how much I needed to bear witness to what this place has been, to refuse the erasure." "You did not stop the people from leaving," Margaret said, her voice gentle but certain. "You allowed them their choice, and you chose to remain. Both decisions honored the village in their own way. They continued their work, and the afternoon deepened around them. The light through the window shifted from pale gold to violet to the deep blue of early winter dusk. Margaret prepared the evening meal, a rich soup made from preserved vegetables and the last of the fall's harvest of mushrooms, dried and stored with care. As they ate, Oswin told stories about individual villagers, not with sadness, but with a kind of gratitude for having known them, for having shared a place and time with people now scattered across distant valleys and cities. He spoke about the baker Elena's particular way of laughing, about the Smith Thomas's absolute concentration when solving a difficult problem in metal, about the schoolmaster's patience with children who struggled to learn letters. Margaret listened and held these stories within her, understanding that she was becoming a repository of the village's memory, a keeper not just of medicines and supplies, but of the human history that had inhabited this place. One evening, several weeks into their shared life, Oswin asked Margaret about her own history, where she had come from before arriving to apprentice with Catherine the healer. "I came from a valley town 3 days' walk down the mountains," Margaret said. Her dark hair was unbound now, hanging loose around her shoulders as she stirred the fire. "My mother was a weaver, and my father died when I was very young. I barely remember him. My mother wanted me to have knowledge, wanted me to learn something that would make me valuable to any community. She heard about Catherine and arranged for me to apprentice here." "And your mother?" Oswin asked gently. "She died the winter before last," Margaret replied. Her work-reddened hands folded in her lap and her voice remained steady. "She became ill in early winter and the sickness took her before spring. I was with her at the end. She told me I had made the right choice, staying in the mountains. She said I had found my purpose." Margaret paused, and a slight smile crossed her face, barely perceptible but genuine. "She also made me promise I would not sacrifice my life entirely to the mountains. She said a person needs both solitude and connection, both work and rest, both purpose and joy. I carry that promise with me." The fire crackled softly, and the warmth of the cottage seemed to gather around them both. Outside, the mountains held their vigil, and within the small stone building, 2 people, separated by 41 years in age but bound by their choice to remain, to witness, to preserve, sat in companionable silence. As the evening deepened, Margaret brought out a small wooden pipe that had belonged to Catherine, the previous healer. She had never played it before, had kept it stored carefully as a kind of sacred object. But now, understanding that music was also a form of witnessing, a way of honoring what had been, she raised it to her lips. The notes that emerged were not complex or practiced, but they were true, simple melodies that seemed to belong to the mountains themselves. Oswin listened with his eyes closed, and when Margaret finished, he opened them and looked at her with an expression that held both sorrow and profound peace. "That was beautiful," he said simply. "Elena used to hum while she worked. That melody, it reminds me of something she might have hummed." Margaret set down the pipe and returned her attention to the fire. The night stretched ahead, long and quiet and full of the particular kind of comfort that comes from shared experience, shared loss, shared commitment to bearing witness. As they prepared for sleep, Oswin moved with slightly more ease than he had weeks before. The remedies Margaret had been preparing seemed to ease his joint pain, and his sleep had become deeper, more restorative. The simple act of being cared for, of having someone attend to his comfort, had restored something in him that months of solitude had depleted. Margaret, 32 years old, lay in her own bed and reflected on how her life had transformed. The cottage that had seemed spacious enough for one person now felt perfectly proportioned for two. The work that had been solitary was now shared, made lighter by division and enriched by companionship. Outside, the snow continued to fall, layer upon layer, covering the empty cottages of the village, erasing the paths that people had walked. But here, in this small space where fire burned and medicines waited on shelves, the village's story continued. It continued through memory and attention, and the quiet courage of two people who had decided that some places were worth remaining for, that witness was a form of love, that keeping a fire burning through darkness mattered. The mountains held them both, held the village, held the history, held the possibility that something lost might be found again, transformed but not destroyed, remembered but not merely mourned. Winter deepened into its most severe phase, and the mountains seemed to contract around the village, drawing everything into an intimate circle of snow and stone, and the particular silence that comes only in the deepest cold. Margaret and Oswin had settled so thoroughly into their shared rhythm that it was difficult to remember the time before Oswin's arrival, when the cottage had held only one person, when the work had been solitary, when the village had been merely landscape rather than inhabited memory. The cold this year was more intense than the previous winter. Some mornings, the water Margaret kept in ceramic vessels for washing had frozen solid overnight, and the fire required constant attention to maintain warmth throughout the cottage. But they had prepared well, and Margaret's careful rationing of resources meant they never faced true scarcity, only the constant vigilance required by survival in a high mountain place. One morning, when the thermometer of ice had spread across the window in crystalline patterns, Oswin woke with a cough that rattled in his 73-year-old chest. Margaret heard it and rose immediately, moving through the pre-dawn darkness with the certainty of someone who had tended to illness countless times before. She prepared a hot tea with her dark hair bound carefully beneath her linen coif, selecting herbs with precision: coltsfoot for the cough, thyme for the inflammation in his chest, honey to soothe his throat. Her work-reddened hands moved with absolute confidence, and she brought the cup to Oswin as he sat propped on his sleeping bench. "Drink slowly," she instructed, her voice carrying the calm authority of a healer. "Let it coat your throat. The warmth will help as much as the herbs themselves." Oswin drank, and the steam from the cup seemed to ease something in his breathing almost immediately. Margaret remained nearby, keeping the fire high, ensuring the cottage stayed warm even as the cold outside seemed to intensify. She understood without needing to be told that this cough represented a turning point, that Oswin's aging body, despite their care and the improving conditions of winter life, was beginning to speak in the language of mortality. Over the following days, she increased the frequency of remedies, added additional herbs to his daily tea, ensured he remained warm and well-fed. She prepared broths infused with minerals and slow-cooked until they contained the essence of nourishment. Oswin accepted all of this with the gratitude of someone who had lived long enough to understand the difference between healing attempts and genuine care. "I am not afraid," he told her one afternoon when the fever had passed and he was sitting near the fire, wrapped in quilts. His eyes held the clarity of someone who had made peace with difficult truths. "I have lived 73 years old. I have seen much. I have loved and lost. If my body decides it is time to rest, I am ready." Margaret did not respond immediately. She was preparing a poultice for his chest, her hands moving with the practiced efficiency of repetition. When she finally spoke, her voice held the authority of someone who had witnessed many passages between life and death. "Your body is not deciding yet," she said. "What it is doing is reminding us both that we are temporary, that time moves through us all, that nothing persists unchanged. That is not a call to surrender. It is a call to attention." The cough lingered through the next weeks, but it gradually eased. Oswin grew stronger, moving with renewed mobility, his breathing becoming clearer with each passing day. Margaret's remedies seemed to work in concert with his body's own resilience, creating a kind of partnership between the healer's knowledge and the patient's will to continue. As Oswin recovered, he became more active in the cottage's work. He began to take primary responsibility for maintaining the fire through the night hours, allowing Margaret longer periods of uninterrupted sleep. He gathered wood from the covered storage area, split kindling, organized supplies with a precision that suggested he had worked with his hands throughout his long life. "I was not always an elder," he explained one morning, as they worked together preparing the day's food. "When I was younger, I worked as a carpenter's apprentice. I made doors and window frames and furniture. I only became an elder when I was 60 years old, after the previous elder died, and the village voted to ask if I would take the role." Margaret listened while her hands continued their work, shaping dough for bread. His 73-year-old hands showed the particular kind of strength that came from decades of skilled work, hands that knew how to move with intention and precision, hands that understood materials and their properties. "You have two callings then," Margaret observed. "The work of your hands and the work of leadership. Both required patience and attention to detail." "Three callings," Oswin corrected gently. "The third is witnessing. That is the work I am doing now, alongside you, bearing witness to what has been, to what continues, to the particular kind of beauty that exists in ruins tended with care." The months passed, and the calendar of winter began its gradual shift towards spring. The light lingered longer each day, the sun's arc across the sky expanded, and the snow began, almost imperceptibly at first, to settle and compress as the temperature slowly rose. The village remained unchanged, cottages still empty, paths still unmarked by human footsteps, but the approaching season brought a kind of renewal to the two people who tended it. Margaret and Oswin began to plan for spring with the care that came from understanding they had survived another winter, that they would continue to survive. They discussed which cottages to repair first, which materials would need to be gathered, and what work could be accomplished with just two people determined to maintain the village's physical structures. One afternoon, when the sun had actual warmth in it for the first time in months, they ventured into the village with tools they had gathered and organized. Oswin, moving with the confidence of his restored strength, showed Margaret how to assess damage to roofs and walls, how to identify which repairs were most urgent, and how to plan the work in order of importance. "The baker's cottage should be first," he said, his 73-year-old eyes scanning the building with knowledge earned through decades of observation. "The roof has weakened on the north side. If we repair it now, before the heavy spring rains come, we can preserve the structure. If we wait, the water damage will become extensive." They began with small repairs, securing loose stones, replacing cracked tiles where the roof had been damaged by winter ice, checking the integrity of windows and doors. Margaret's work-reddened hands adapted quickly to these new tasks, and she found that the knowledge of materials and structure came naturally to her after years of tending to organic growth and preservation. As they worked, they spoke about the people who had lived in these cottages, and gradually a new kind of memory-keeping emerged. Oswin would tell a story about whoever had inhabited the building they were repairing, and Margaret would listen while her hands continued their work. These stories seemed to sanctify the labor, transforming physical repair into something more, into an act of honoring, of testimony, of refusing erasure. By the time the afternoon light began to shift, they had completed substantial work on the baker's cottage. The roof was secure, the windows were sound, the structure felt solid and protected. As they stepped back to observe their work, Oswin placed a hand on Margaret's shoulder, a gesture of acknowledgement and gratitude. "Elena would be pleased," he said simply. "The building that held her life's work will endure." That evening, as they returned to Margaret's cottage and prepared for sleep, something had shifted in both of them. They had moved beyond merely surviving together and toward actively creating something, maintaining not just themselves, but the physical world that held the memory of the village's existence. Margaret lay in her bed and reflected on how her life had continued to transform. The cottage was no longer simply her refuge. It had become a kind of headquarters for a larger project, the project of keeping alive a place that the world had deemed abandoned, of insisting through daily work and attention that what had been mattered, that memory required witness, that some things were worth preserving even when the world moved on. Outside, the mountains held their eternal vigil. The village rested beneath the slowly warming sky, and in the small stone cottage where herbs hung from beams and medicines waited on shelves, Margaret, 32 years old, and Oswin, 73 years old, rested from their labor, their hands bearing the marks of work, their hearts full of the particular peace that comes from purposeful action. Spring was coming. The snow would melt. New growth would emerge from the earth, and two people would be ready to meet it, to continue their witness, to keep the fire burning and the village remembered. Spring arrived not all at once, but in layers. First, the gradual lengthening of light, then the softer quality to the snow, then finally the sound of water running from the melting peaks, creating small streams that carved their way down the mountain sides. Margaret and Oswin woke one morning to discover the snow had receded enough to reveal the stone paths of the village, and they both understood without speaking that a new season of work had begun. The repairs they had started in late winter now accelerated. Oswin, moving with the energy of a man who had found purpose, worked alongside Margaret with the dedication of someone who understood that the work he was doing mattered in ways that extended beyond mere preservation. They moved through the village cottage by cottage, assessing damage, making repairs, ensuring that the structures would endure. Margaret, 32 years old, found herself learning skills she had never imagined she would need. Her work-reddened hands, accustomed to grinding herbs and measuring medicines, adapted to the work of carpentry and masonry. Oswin taught her with patience, showing her how to assess the integrity of wood, how to identify rot before it became catastrophic, and how to understand the particular vulnerabilities of structures exposed to mountain winters. One morning, as they worked on repairing the schoolmaster's cottage, Oswin shared a memory that seemed to unlock something in both of them. The schoolmaster's name was Matthew, he said, his hands working methodically to replace damaged window frames. He came from the city 40 years ago, sent by the bishop to provide education to the village children. He was young then, perhaps 30 years old, and he grieved terribly at first for the life he had left behind. But slowly, he fell in love with the mountains, with the children, with the particular kind of community that forms when everyone is necessary to everyone else's survival. Margaret paused in her work, listening with the attention she brought to all of Oswin's stories. Her dark hair, bound beneath her linen coif, caught the morning light that streamed through the partially repaired window. "What became of him?" she asked, though she thought she might already know. "He left with the others," Oswin said. "His sister became ill in the city and he went to care for her. But before he departed, he gave me something. He said that what mattered about teaching was not the building or the formal arrangement of lessons, but the transmission of knowledge from one person to another. He said that would continue, no matter where he went or where his students went, that the village would live on in the minds of everyone who had been taught here." Margaret considered this, understanding that Oswin was processing his own role in the village's departure, reconciling himself with the choices that had been made. She moved to stand beside him, and together they looked at the cottage they were restoring, not for any immediate practical purpose, but as an act of honoring what had been, of insisting that the structure deserved continuation. The weeks progressed with the rhythm of spring labor. The snow continued its retreat, the earth beneath began to thaw, and new growth started to emerge from the ground. Margaret and Oswin ventured beyond the village to gather the plants that were beginning to show themselves, the early greens, the roots that could be harvested, the materials that would renew Margaret's depleted supplies. On one such expedition, they discovered something extraordinary. In a sheltered area near the old pasture where sheep had once grazed, a small herb garden had survived, plants that had clearly been deliberately cultivated and protected by careful placement and early covering before winter. The garden bore the marks of intentional care, and both Margaret and Oswin understood immediately what it represented. "Catherine," Margaret said, her voice carrying wonder and a kind of gratitude. "The previous healer. She must have established this, protected it, ensured it would survive. They tended the garden carefully, removing the protective coverings, clearing away debris, assessing what had survived and what had been lost. Several plants had endured, hardy herbs like thyme and oregano, sage and medicinal comfrey. But more remarkably, they discovered that seeds Catherine must have stored had somehow been planted here, perhaps deliberately, perhaps through some accident of wind and moisture, and were now sprouting into new life. "She left you a gift," Oswin said, his 73-year-old eyes reflecting the significance of the discovery. "Knowledge, yes, but also practical support. The gift of plants that would help you continue the work." Margaret knelt in the soil, her work-reddened hands touching the earth with reverence. She understood at that moment that she was connected to a lineage of healers stretching back beyond Catherine's teachers, into a deep history of knowledge being passed forward. She was not alone in her work. She was part of a continuum, inheriting the labor of those who had come before, carrying forward the knowledge that would sustain those who came after. They spent the remainder of the afternoon expanding and tending the garden, clearing spaces for new plants, marking out areas where Margaret would plant seeds she had saved from the previous year. As they worked, Oswin spoke about the seasons to come, about how this garden would grow and produce throughout the summer, how it would provide the foundation for the medicines and remedies that Margaret would need. As evening approached and they made their way back toward the cottage, the light had taken on the golden quality of late spring, and the mountains seemed less imposing, more welcoming, as if the warming season had gentled them somehow. Margaret paused at a high point and looked back at the village, at the cottages they had repaired, at the paths they had cleared, at the garden they had just tended, and she felt a kind of completion, though not in the sense of finishing. Rather, it was the completion of understanding that the work was never truly finished, that it would continue forward across seasons and years, that what mattered was the commitment to continue, not the achievement of final completion. "Do you think others will ever return?" she asked Oswin as they walked the final distance to her cottage. Oswin was quiet for a long moment, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Some may," he finally said. "Children who grew up here might eventually return, wanting to reconnect with the place of their childhood. Others might flee difficult circumstances in the cities and remember that mountains offer refuge. Or new people might find their way here, drawn by word of mouth, by the reputation of a place that was tended even when abandoned." He paused, his weathered face turning toward the setting sun. "But what matters is not whether they return. What matters is that you will be ready if they do, that the village will not have been entirely consumed by time and forgetting, that there will be someone here to welcome them, to pass forward the knowledge, to help them understand the particular kind of beauty that exists in this high place." That night, as they prepared the evening meal, a rich stew made with spring greens and the last of the stored root vegetables, Margaret felt a profound sense of rightness. The cottage was warm. The fire was strong. The village rested peacefully around them, and two people who had chosen to remain were tending both the physical structures and the knowledge that those structures had held. After they had eaten, Oswin brought out the village record book and with Margaret's encouragement began to write again. His handwriting was slightly unsteady but legible, and his words recorded not just the facts of their survival but the texture of the experience. The cold winters, the repairs they had made, the discovery of Catherine's garden, the decision to tend the village as an act of honoring what had been. Future readers should know, he said as he wrote, that this village was not simply abandoned and forgotten. It was held in memory. It was tended. It was loved even in emptiness. Margaret listened to the scratch of his pen on paper, the sound of memory being recorded, of history being documented. She understood that this act of writing was as important as the physical repairs they had made, that the village existed now in two forms, in stone and wood and the maintained structures of daily life, and in the written record of people who had chosen to witness and remember. As the evening deepened and they prepared for sleep, the spring night settled around the cottage with a gentleness that winter had never permitted. The sound of running water from the melting snow provided a constant, soothing background, not threatening as rushing water might be, but peaceful, life-giving, the promise of renewal. Margaret, 32 years old, lay in her bed and felt the weight of the seasons that had passed, the transformation that had occurred. She had come to this village as a young apprentice seeking knowledge. She had remained as a healer tending to her craft. And now she had become something more, a keeper not just of medicine but of memory, a witness to abandonment who had refused to accept erasure, a person who understood that some places and some stories demanded that someone stay, that someone remember, that someone tend the fire. Outside, the mountains held the village in their eternal embrace, and within that embrace, spring was arriving in all its renewal and possibility. The work would continue, the seasons would turn, and Margaret and Oswin would be here, tending, remembering, keeping alive the knowledge that even when the world moved on, some people chose to remain, and in remaining, they transformed abandonment into something more meaningful, into witness, into testimony, into love. Summer arrived with an abundance that seemed almost overwhelming after the restraint of winter. The meadows surrounding the village erupted in growth, grasses reaching toward the sun, wildflowers in colors that Margaret had almost forgotten existed, the promise of renewal in every direction. The mountain streams ran clear and cold with snowmelt, and the air held a quality of lightness that made breathing itself seem easier. Margaret and Oswin had established a rhythm that felt as natural as the turning of seasons themselves. The mornings began with tending to the expanding garden, where new growth had already exceeded their expectations. The afternoons brought work on the village cottages. There was always something to repair, always another structure requiring attention. And the evenings held the precious work of preservation, Margaret preparing medicines from the plants that now flourished, Oswin continuing to record their experiences in the village ledger. One morning in early summer, as Margaret was gathering herbs from the garden, she found Oswin sitting on a stone bench near the baker's cottage, his 73-year-old face turned toward the sun. He was not working. He was simply sitting, his hands folded in his lap, his eyes closed, his breathing deep and slow. Margaret paused, understanding intuitively that this was a moment of rest that he needed, and she continued her work without disturbing him. Her work-reddened hands moved through the garden with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this work countless times, selecting the most vibrant plants, gathering them with care that bordered on reverence. When she returned to find Oswin, he opened his eyes and smiled, a slow, peaceful expression that seemed to contain multitudes. "I was remembering," he said simply, "the summers when I was young, when the village was full of people and activity, the celebrations we would hold when the weather was good, the music and dancing and the general sense that we had survived another winter and could now rejoice." Margaret settled onto the bench beside him, her dark hair loose around her shoulders now that the warmth permitted it. "We could have a celebration," she said. Her voice held a kind of gentle suggestion rather than demand. "We could honor the summer, the survival of another year. It need not be elaborate. Two people cannot dance or create the kind of music a full village could create. But we could mark the moment somehow." Oswin turned to look at her, and his expression deepened with what appeared to be profound gratitude. "Yes," he said. "Yes, I think that is exactly what we should do." They spent the following days in preparation. Margaret gathered the finest materials she could find, the best cheese from her carefully maintained stores, bread she baked with particular care, berries that had begun to ripen in the meadows. Oswin, with his carpenter's knowledge, created a simple table from wood he had salvaged during their repairs, and they positioned it in the center of the village square, where once the entire community had gathered. The evening they chose was clear and perfect, with the kind of sunset that seemed to paint the mountains in colors that shouldn't exist, deep purples and golds and shades of rose that seemed to come from another world entirely. They dressed carefully, Margaret in a clean linen dress that she had mended and tended throughout the winter, Oswin in clothes that Oswin had cleaned and pressed with the care of someone preparing for something significant. As the light began its slow descent, they carried their modest feast to the table, the bread, the cheese, berries arranged carefully, and a flask of the herbal tea that Margaret had prepared specifically for this occasion. They also brought candles, which Margaret lit as the sun touched the horizon, creating small flames that seemed to hold the last light of day. They sat across from each other, and Oswin raised his cup in a gesture of ceremony. "To the village," he said, his 73-year-old voice steady and strong. "To the people who built it, who lived in it, who created beauty and meaning in this high place. To those who departed, carrying its memory with them into distant valleys. And to those of us who remain, who have chosen to tend its story, to keep its fire burning, to insist that what was matters, that what is continues." Margaret raised her cup, and they drank together, the warm tea tasting of herbs and honey and the particular flavor of intention. As they ate, they spoke not of loss or sorrow, but of gratitude, for the summer arriving, for the work they had accomplished together, for the discovery that two people could create meaning and purpose in a place that the world had deemed abandoned. As darkness fell completely and the stars emerged, appearing with a clarity that the villages in the valleys would never experience, Oswin stood and moved to the center of the square. Margaret watched as he began to move in a kind of slow dance, his movements careful but unmistakably expressing something like joy. He was humming, and the melody that emerged seemed to belong to the mountains themselves, ancient and timeless. Margaret rose and joined him, and though she had never learned formal dancing, she found that her body understood how to move in concert with him, how to honor the moment, how to express through movement what words could not fully capture. They danced in the candlelight and starlight, two people celebrating not just survival, but the decision to make something meaningful from survival, to transform emptiness into presence. When they finally ceased, both were breathing heavily, both were laughing, not with hysteria, but with the genuine joy that comes from unexpected connection. They sat again at their small table, and Oswin reached across to squeeze Margaret's work-reddened hand. "Thank you," he said simply, "for being here, for staying, for understanding that what we do matters." The night continued, and they remained at the table long after the food was consumed, speaking about everything and nothing, about the patterns of stars, about the names of plants, about memories and hopes, and the peculiar way that a place could contain the history of everyone who had ever inhabited it. Eventually, as the deep night settled around them, they gathered their things and made their way back to the cottage. The stars provided sufficient light to navigate the familiar paths, and the darkness felt protective rather than threatening, the darkness of a place that held them safely within its mountain's embrace. Over the following weeks, the celebration seemed to have shifted something fundamental in both of them. The work continued, the repairs, the medicine-making, the tending of gardens, but it was infused now with a quality of joy that hadn't been present before. They began to sing while they worked, simple songs that Oswin remembered from his youth, melodies that seemed to belong to the mountains. One afternoon, as they were repairing the roof of the schoolmaster's cottage, Margaret paused in her work and looked out across the village and the mountains beyond. "I think I understand now," she said, her dark hair escaping from beneath her linen coif as she turned to face Oswin. "Why Catherine stayed, why you came back, why I remained. It is not because the mountains demand it, though they do. It is because we have chosen to create meaning here, to insist that this place and its history matter. We are not enduring the village, we are celebrating it." Oswin, his 73-year-old hands steady on the tools he held, nodded slowly. "That is precisely it," he said. "Survival becomes endurance when we view it as something imposed upon us. But when we choose it, when we actively create meaning from it, survival becomes something else entirely. It becomes affirmation. It becomes love." As summer deepened and the days stretched toward their longest point, Margaret and Oswin developed a rhythm that felt almost ceremonial. Each evening, as the light began its gradual descent, they would walk through the village, observing the progress of repairs, noting the growth of plants in the gardens they had tended, acknowledging the particular beauty that existed in a place being carefully maintained. One such evening, as they walked past the church, they discovered that birds had begun to nest in its bell tower. The sound of their calls seemed to sanctify the space, to suggest that life continued, that the building's purpose was not lost but transformed. Inside the church, the evening light fell through the windows in patterns of amber and gold, and they sat together in the peaceful silence, understanding without need for words that they were participating in something sacred. By the time late summer arrived and the first hints of autumn began to touch the highest peaks, the village had transformed. The cottages they had repaired stood solid and sound, their roofs secure, their windows intact. The gardens they had tended flourished with abundance. The paths they had cleared were marked with the wear of their regular passage. To any observer, though there were no observers except the mountains and sky, the village appeared tended, cared for, inhabited by intention if not by large numbers. Margaret, 32 years old, stood on a high point above the village one afternoon and looked down at what she and Oswin had created together. She thought about the 417 people who had departed, carrying with them the village's future possibility. And she thought about the 2 people who had remained, insisting that the past and present mattered, that a place could continue to exist not through population, but through care and attention, and the refusal to accept erasure. She understood now that the village had not been truly abandoned. It had been transformed. It had shifted from being a place of residence to being a place of testimony, a physical embodiment of the choice to remember, to witness, to preserve what had been meaningful. And she and Oswin were not the village's final inhabitants, but its first guardians, people who understood that stewardship sometimes meant staying, that love sometimes meant remaining when everyone else departed. As evening came and she made her way back toward the cottage, she found Oswin waiting for her at the garden gate. He held a single flower, a late-blooming Alpine rose, hardy and beautiful, and he offered it to her with a gesture that seemed to contain the entire summer within it. "For you," he said simply, "for the healer who stayed." Margaret accepted the flower, and they walked together toward the cottage as the day's light faded into dusk. The mountains surrounded them, holding them safely within their ancient embrace. The village rested peacefully, tended and remembered, and 2 people moved through the gathering darkness, their work complete for the day, knowing that tomorrow would bring new tasks, new opportunities to care for and preserve the place they had chosen as home. Autumn arrived with a gentleness that seemed almost reluctant, as if the mountains were delaying the season's inevitable shift toward winter. The leaves on the few trees that grew in the high valleys turned to colors that seemed impossible, shades of amber and copper and deep burgundy, and the air began to carry the particular clarity that comes as the warm season releases its grip. Margaret and Oswin had developed an understanding about the approaching winter that was different from the previous year's survival mentality. This time, they were not simply preparing to endure. They were preparing to continue the work they had begun. The repairs were largely complete. The gardens had produced abundantly, and the medicines were being prepared with the expertise that came from knowing the work mattered not just for their own survival, but for the possibility of future inhabitants. One morning, as the first frost touched the meadow grasses with silver, Margaret and Oswin made an expedition to the high pasture to gather the plants that would dry well for winter storage. Margaret, 32 years old, moved through the meadow with work-reddened hands, selecting specimens with care, understanding that each plant represented potential healing, potential comfort, potential sustenance through the months ahead. Oswin followed, his 73-year-old frame moving with the ease that came from months of shared labor. He carried a large basket, and as Margaret filled it with her selections, he sorted and organized, ensuring each plant was positioned to dry properly once they returned to the cottage. "I have been thinking," Oswin said as they worked, his voice carrying across the meadow where the wind moved through the grasses, about what should happen after I am no longer here. Margaret paused in her work, though she did not look up. She had known this conversation was coming, had sensed Oswin's awareness of his own mortality, had understood that he was preparing her for a future she would need to face alone. Her steady hands continued their work while she listened. "You will continue," Oswin continued, his words deliberate and clear. "You are young enough to have many years ahead of you. You will maintain the village, tend the gardens, and prepare the medicines. You will do the work that Catherine taught you, that I have watched you master. And if people return, or if new people arrive, you will welcome them and teach them as Catherine taught you." "How can you speak so calmly about your own absence?" Margaret asked. Her voice held no accusation, only genuine curiosity, the kind of question that could only come from someone who had learned to accept the difficult truths of existence. Oswin paused in his work and turned to face her. "Because I have lived long," he said. 73 years old is a long life, Margaret. I have seen much, loved much, lost much. I have witnessed the rise and fall of villages, the departure of people I cared for, the transformation of places I thought permanent. I have learned that the only permanence is change, and the only meaningful response to change is to tend what you can while you can, and then to trust that others will continue the work." He moved closer to her, and his weathered face held an expression of profound peace. "When my time comes, and it will come perhaps soon, perhaps not for years, I will have no regrets. I will have spent these final years doing work that matters, alongside a person I have come to love and respect. That is more than most people receive." Margaret felt tears touch her eyes, and she did not brush them away. "I do not know if I can do this alone," she said quietly. "The village is larger than I am. The work is larger than one person." "Then you will need to trust," Oswin replied, "that the work itself will sustain you, that the mountains will provide, that the knowledge you carry will be enough. You will not be alone, Margaret. You will have the memory of everyone who has ever lived here. You will have the work itself. And perhaps, if you are fortunate, you will have visitors, students, people drawn to this place seeking something they cannot find elsewhere." They gathered the remainder of the plants and made their way back to the cottage as the afternoon light began its descent. The work of preparing the herbs for winter storage took several days, selecting, hanging, organizing, ensuring each specimen was positioned for optimal drying. Margaret found that her hands knew what to do, that the knowledge Catherine had taught her had become so deeply integrated that it felt almost instinctive. As the weeks progressed into deeper autumn, the village took on a different character. The leaves fell, revealing the stone structures more clearly, showing which roofs remained sound and which might need additional attention before winter. The gardens were harvested completely, their produce stored in Margaret's carefully maintained root cellar or dried, and preserved for use through the cold months. One afternoon, as they were organizing the final preparations, Oswin brought out a bundle of letters from his house in the village center. They were carefully wrapped in cloth and sealed with wax, and his expression suggested they held great significance. "These are from my daughter," he said. His voice carried a weight of emotion he had not fully expressed before. "She left with the departing group last autumn. She wanted to establish a new life in the city, to give her children opportunities that the mountains could not offer. I have not seen her for a year. Margaret watched as he carefully opened the first letter, his 73-year-old hands trembling slightly with the emotion of connection to someone he loved and had not physically been near for so long. She writes that they are well, Oswin read aloud, his voice steady despite the tears that had begun to track down his weathered face. Her husband has found work as a mason. Her children are learning their letters. She asks if I am managing alone, if I am eating enough, if I am warm. She asks if I might consider coming to join them in the city. He paused and looked at Margaret. I have written back each time, telling her that I have chosen to remain, that I am not alone, that I am doing work that matters. In my most recent letter, I told her about you, about the healer who stayed, about the village we are rebuilding together through our care and attention. What did she say? Margaret asked gently. Oswin held up another letter, dated more recently. She wrote that she was relieved to know I was not entirely alone, that she understood my choice to stay even though she could not make it herself. She wrote that she hopes the village will continue, that perhaps one day, when her children are older, they might return to know the place where their grandfather lived, where their family history is rooted. Margaret felt the weight of that possibility, that future inhabitants might indeed return, might seek to reconnect with the place they had come from. It shifted something in her understanding of the work she and Oswin were doing. They were not simply preserving for themselves or for the mountains themselves. They were preserving for the possibility of future return, for the children and grandchildren who might one day wonder about the village their ancestors had left. As autumn deepened toward winter, Margaret and Oswin established new routines that acknowledged the approaching season. They spent more time indoors now, working on projects that could be completed by firelight, mending clothes, organizing supplies, documenting their experiences in the village ledger. Oswin's handwriting had become less steady, but his words remained clear and purposeful, and Margaret often sat nearby, listening as he read aloud what he had written, ensuring that the record was accurate and complete. One evening, as the first real snow began to fall, covering the village in white silence, Oswin spoke about his will. I have very little, he said, his voice matter-of-fact but not harsh. Some money carefully saved over many years, furnishings from my house. The record books, those are the most valuable things I possess. When I am gone, everything should come to you, not because you need it for survival, but because you are the one who will carry forward the work. The record books especially, they are the memory of this village made tangible. You must preserve them, add to them, ensure they continue. Margaret listened without interruption, understanding that Oswin needed to speak these practical matters into existence, to ensure that his knowledge and possessions would be properly distributed. When he finished, she simply nodded. I will honor that trust, she said quietly. I will keep the records, maintain the village, and preserve the knowledge. I promise. Oswin reached across and took her work-reddened hand in his weathered one. I know you will, he said. That is why I can face the coming seasons with peace. The winter that followed was milder than the previous year, and both Margaret and Oswin understood this as a kind of gift. Time granted, easier conditions, an extended opportunity to continue their work together. They maintained the routines they had established, the careful management of fire, the preparation of medicines, the daily tasks that sustained life in the mountains. But there was also a new quality to their time together, a kind of intentional savoring of moments, an understanding that this particular configuration of life, two people tending a village together, would not persist indefinitely. When Oswin sat by the fire and taught Margaret new techniques for preserving herbs, when they walked through the village on clear winter days and discussed plans for spring repairs, when they sat together in the evening and Oswin read aloud from the village records, there was an awareness that these moments held their own kind of precious finality. By the time late winter arrived and the season began its slow turn toward spring, Margaret and Oswin had settled into a kind of peace about the future. They had done the work that was necessary. They had tended the village. They had created a record. They had established rhythms and routines that Margaret could continue independently if necessary. And they had discovered something that neither had fully anticipated when Oswin arrived in the snow more than a year before. That two people choosing to remain, choosing to tend, choosing to preserve what the world had deemed abandoned, could create something meaningful and beautiful. Not a replacement for what had been lost, but a transformation of loss into witness, into testimony, into love expressed through daily care. Spring returned with a persistence that seemed almost defiant, pushing through the last snow, bringing green shoots from the earth that had been frozen for months. Margaret and Oswin emerged from the winter stronger than they had been the year before, their bodies adapted to the rhythms of the mountains, their spirits settled into the work they had claimed as theirs. The repairs they had planned for spring began immediately. The stone cottage near the village center, Oswin's former residence, required extensive work on its roof and walls. Margaret and Oswin approached the task together, and the old man moved with a determination that seemed to come from wanting to restore the place he had lived, to ensure it remained sound for whatever future might bring. As they worked, replacing damaged stones and securing loose roof tiles, Oswin told Margaret about the years he had spent in that cottage after his wife Elena had died. "I could have moved," he said, his 73-year-old hands steady as they positioned stones into mortar. "The village offered me other homes, but I remained here because the rooms held her memory. The kitchen where she baked, the sleeping chamber where we spent so many nights, the small garden where she grew flowers. I thought that leaving would mean losing her. I did not understand then that memory lives in us, not in places." Margaret listened while her work-reddened hands worked alongside his. "And now," she asked, "do you still feel that way?" "Now I understand that we carry people with us," Oswin replied. "Elena is with me not because I live in the cottage where we shared our life, but because I choose to remember her, to honor what we created together, to live in ways that reflect the values she embodied. The cottage is simply stone and wood, but the love, that is portable, that travels with us." By early summer, the cottage was largely restored, and Oswin stood back to observe their work with an expression of quiet satisfaction. The building that had sheltered his most significant years was again sound, again protected, again capable of enduring whatever seasons might come. It was around this time that Margaret first noticed the change in Oswin's physical condition. It was subtle at first, a slight hesitation in his movements, a tendency to pause more frequently during work, a quality to his breathing that suggested his 73-year-old body was working harder than it had been. She did not mention it directly, respecting his autonomy, but she began to prepare remedies specifically designed to support his heart and lungs, adding them to his daily tea without drawing attention to the change. One afternoon, as they rested in the shade near the herb garden, Oswin spoke of his own accord. "I can feel the difference," he said. His weathered face was turned toward the mountains, and his expression held a kind of peaceful acceptance. "My body is telling me that it is beginning to tire, that the work of continuing is becoming more difficult. I do not fear this, Margaret. I have lived a long life. I have seen much. I have spent these final months doing work that matters, alongside a person I have come to love as I might have loved a daughter." Margaret's hands resting in her lap trembled slightly. "What are you saying?" she asked, though she knew the answer already. "I am saying that you should prepare yourself," Oswin replied gently. "Not with sadness, with readiness. Teach me what I need to know about the medicines so that you have not needed to repeat yourself. Let me help you organize the records so that you understand exactly how they are arranged. Help me prepare for a transition that may come gradually or suddenly, but will come." The conversation shifted something fundamental in their relationship. Margaret began to intentionally document everything Oswin knew about the village, the names of every person who had lived in every cottage, the particular histories and stories he carried, the knowledge that existed only in his 73-year-old mind. She brought out parchment and ink, and while Oswin rested in the afternoons, she wrote down what he told her, creating a new kind of record that was not formal like the village ledger but deeply personal, full of the texture of lived experience. "The baker's cottage held Elena," she wrote. "She made bread that carried the memory of summer in every bite. Her son Thomas became a smith in the city. Her daughter married a merchant from the valleys and had 3 children. Elena died in the cottage where she baked, and her hands were flour-dusted even at the end." And so it went, cottage by cottage, person by person, history by history. Oswin seemed to find peace in this documentation, as if by speaking his memories aloud and having them recorded, he was ensuring their continuation, their transmission to the future. As summer deepened, the village took on a different quality. The work was less about repairs and more about tending, maintaining what had been restored, ensuring the gardens flourished, preparing medicines and preserving foods for the coming winter. But there was also a quality of ceremony to it now, an understanding that Oswin was teaching Margaret not just practical skills, but a way of being present to a place, a way of honoring what had been through careful attention to what was. One particularly beautiful afternoon, when the light fell through the mountains in shades of gold, and the meadows were full of wildflowers, Oswin suggested they make the journey to the high pasture where Margaret had first discovered Catherine's hidden garden. Margaret supported him as they walked, moving slowly, pausing frequently for rest, but his determination to make the journey was absolute. When they arrived at the garden, they found it thriving beyond expectation. The herbs Margaret had tended were producing abundantly, and the space had taken on an almost sacred quality, a place where knowledge persisted, where the work of previous generations bore fruit, where the future was being prepared in concrete botanical ways. Oswin settled onto a stone, and Margaret sat beside him. They did not speak for a long time, simply observing the garden, watching the light shift across the plants, feeling the presence of Catherine and all the healers who had come before her. "This is what matters," Oswin finally said. His voice was quiet, barely audible above the sound of wind through the herbs. "Not the buildings or the records, though those matter too. What matters is that knowledge continues, that someone tends the plants, that healing persists, that the understanding of how to live well in this place passes forward." "I will tend to it," Margaret said. Her work-reddened hands lay folded in her lap, and her dark hair caught the golden light of late afternoon. "I will teach others if they come. I will ensure the knowledge continues." "I know you will," Oswin replied. "That is why I can rest now. That is why my heart can be at peace." The journey back to the cottage took twice as long as the journey out, and by the time they arrived, Oswin was clearly exhausted. Margaret helped him to his sleeping bench and prepared a restorative tea, understanding without need for words that something had shifted, that Oswin's body was beginning its final descent. Over the following weeks, Oswin spent more time resting and less time working. But his mind remained clear, and he continued to document, to teach, to ensure that Margaret had everything she needed to continue. He also began writing letters to his daughter in the city, to former neighbors, to anyone who had been part of the village's history. Letters that attempted to capture something of what had been, what continued, what might yet come. Margaret tended to him with the care she had learned from Catherine, preparing medicines, ensuring he was warm and comfortable, sitting with him in the evenings and reading aloud from the village records or the letters he had written. She understood that she was participating in something profound, the graceful passing of responsibility, the intentional transmission of knowledge, the honoring of a life lived fully. One evening, as the summer light lingered late into the night, Oswin asked Margaret to sit close beside him. "I want you to know something," he said. His 73-year-old voice had grown thin but retained its clarity. "Before I came to your cottage that winter morning, I was ready to stop. My body ached, my heart was heavy, and I did not see purpose in continuing. But you gave me purpose. You showed me that tending a place, witnessing history, preserving knowledge, these are worthy ways to spend a life. You saved me, Margaret, perhaps not from death that comes for us all, but from despair. From the belief that my remaining years were simply counting down to nothing." Margaret felt tears on her cheeks, and she took Oswin's weathered hand in both of hers. "You saved me too," she said quietly. "You showed me that solitude need not mean loneliness, that a small community of two people can create meaning just as a village of hundreds can. You showed me that staying matters." They sat together in the long twilight, neither needing to speak further, simply present to each other, and to the quiet understanding that their time together was drawing toward its natural conclusion. As late summer arrived and the first hints of autumn began to touch the highest peaks, Oswin grew progressively weaker, but his mind remained engaged, and he continued to dictate notes to Margaret. Final thoughts, final stories, final observations about the village and the people who had inhabited it. His handwriting, when he attempted to write himself, was barely legible, but Margaret carefully transcribed his words, ensuring that nothing was lost. On a morning when the light fell particularly clear through the cottage window, illuminating every detail of the room they had shared, Oswin asked Margaret to bring him the village record book. She placed it carefully in his hands, and he opened it, leafing through page after page of documentation. His years as elder, the careful records he had maintained, the additions he had made during his time with Margaret. "It is complete," he said, though his voice was barely above a whisper now. "Not finished, it can never be finished, but complete enough. You will continue it. You will add to it. Future people will add to it. This is how knowledge persists. This is how we refuse erasure." He looked at Margaret with eyes that seemed to contain the entire history of the village, all the people he had known, all the seasons he had witnessed. "I am ready," he said simply. "I have lived long, loved well, and done work that mattered. Whatever comes next, I am ready." Margaret held his hand as the day progressed, as the light shifted, as the mountains seemed to draw closer, as if acknowledging the passage of something significant. She did not leave his side, understanding that her presence mattered, that bearing witness to this transition was part of the work she had committed to. And as the evening deepened into night, as the stars emerged above the mountains, as the eternal rhythm of seasons and stars continued its patient unfolding, Margaret held the hand of the man who had returned from the snow and chosen, with her, to tend the village, to preserve its memory, to insist that what had been mattered and would continue to matter. His breathing gradually slowed, became more shallow, and finally ceased. And Margaret, 32 years old, sat in silence with the body of a man she had come to love, understanding that her solitary work would continue, that the village would remain in her care, that the knowledge and love they had created together would persist through her continued attention and witness. Margaret did not move immediately. She sat with Oswin's hand held gently in both of hers, understanding that there was a threshold being crossed, a moment that required presence and acknowledgement before the practical work of what came next could begin. The night continued its progression around her. The fire in the cottage's hearth burned steadily, casting shadows that seemed to hold the presence of everyone who had ever inhabited this space. Catherine before her, all the healers stretching back into time, and now Oswin, whose final breath had released him from the weight of continuing. By the time true darkness had arrived and the mountains had settled into their deep night silence, Margaret understood what she needed to do. She carefully removed Oswin's hand from hers and folded it gently across his chest. Then she rose, moving with the deliberate care of someone performing ritual work, and began to prepare the body for what would come next. She washed him with water she had warmed over the fire, using cloth that had been softened by years of use. Her work-reddened hands, which had ground herbs and prepared medicines and worked stone and wood alongside his, now performed this final service with the same attention she brought to all her tasks. She dressed him in the finest clothes she could find, clean linen, a tunic of good wool that had belonged to Catherine, and had been stored carefully all these years. As she worked, Margaret spoke to him, understanding that speech was a form of honoring, a way of acknowledging the significance of what had occurred. "You came in the winter, 73 years old, carrying the weight of departure and the loneliness of solitude," she said, her voice steady in the quiet cottage. "You left knowing that the village would be tended, that the knowledge would persist, that your life had mattered. That is more than most people receive, Oswin. That is a kind of completeness." When she had finished washing and dressing him, she wrapped his body carefully in the finest cloth she possessed, linen she had been saving, uncertain for what purpose until this moment. She placed his record book on his chest, understanding that the documentation of his life should accompany him, that the knowledge and the man who had carried it should remain connected. Then, as the night deepened toward its darkest hours, Margaret did something that surprised herself. She brought out the small wooden pipe that had belonged to Catherine, the one she had played only once before, and she began to play. The notes emerged slowly, uncertainly at first, then with greater confidence, simple melodies that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than conscious knowledge. She played for hours, it seemed, the music filling the cottage with something that transcended sorrow, a kind of acknowledgement that spanned the boundary between life and whatever came after. By the time dawn began to touch the eastern mountains, Margaret had played herself into a kind of peaceful exhaustion. She set down the pipe and sat beside Oswin's body, and she allowed herself to weep, not with the sharp pain of sudden loss, but with the deeper tears that come from understanding that something significant has concluded, that a chapter has ended, that the work must continue without the person who had helped her begin it. As the morning light strengthened, Margaret understood what needed to happen next. In the high valleys where villages were small and resources were limited, the dead were not buried underground in the way of larger settlements. Instead, they were placed in the small stone structure on the mountainside above the village, the ossuary that had held the bones of previous generations, a place where the mountains themselves seemed to cradle the remains of those who had lived upon them. Margaret could not carry Oswin's body alone, and she did not attempt to. Instead, she performed the work in stages, moving his body with care and respect, eventually positioning it on a flat stone outside the cottage where the morning air could touch it, where the mountains could bear witness. Then she did something that surprised even herself. She went to the village center and rang the church bell, not the urgent, rapid ringing that would have called people to emergency, but a slow, measured tolling that seemed to echo across the empty valley. She rang it once for each year of Oswin's life, 73 times, the sound carrying across the mountains, announcing to whatever spirits or memories inhabited the place that someone significant had passed, that the village's population had shifted once again, that change had come to the high place. When the ringing was complete, Margaret stood in the silence that followed and made a decision. She would not take Oswin's body to the ossuary alone. She would prepare it properly. She would honor the traditions she understood from fragments of knowledge Catherine had shared, and she would invite the mountains themselves to witness the transition. Over the following days, Margaret kept Oswin's body in the cottage, tending to it with the same care she might have tended to any person who was ill or vulnerable. She lit candles and kept the fire burning. She sat beside him and spoke to him and read aloud from the village records, understanding that this period of liminal time, between life and the final resting place, mattered, that it was not something to rush through but to honor with intention. On the third day, when the body had been prepared according to the customs Margaret could recall, she made the journey to the ossuary. She carried Oswin wrapped carefully, supported on a stretcher she had constructed from wood and cloth. The walk up the mountainside took hours, and it was physically demanding in ways that pushed her body to its limits. But Margaret's 32-year-old strength, developed through months of outdoor work and stone repair, held firm. The ossuary was a small structure of fitted stone, built centuries earlier by hands long since turned to dust. Inside, arranged on stone shelves, were the remains of previous generations, bones that had been carefully placed, that had been tended by people who understood that honoring the dead was a way of honoring the entire human story. Margaret placed Oswin's body on a stone shelf in a position of honor, positioning it with care, understanding that he was joining a community that extended back through time, that his remains would rest among people he had known, people who had lived in the village before him, people whose lives had shaped the place he had chosen to remain in. When she had arranged everything to her satisfaction, Margaret sat on the threshold of the ossuary and spoke aloud. "Oswin, 73 years old," she said, her voice carrying across the high mountain silence. "You were the elder of this village. You guided people through difficult times. You made decisions that allowed others to survive, even when those decisions required letting them depart. You came back to tend what remained. You taught me how to honor a place through presence and care. You showed me that isolation can become a community, that two people can create meaning together. You leave behind a village that will be remembered, knowledge that will persist, a record that will continue. Rest well. The work will go on." The journey back down the mountain was slower than the ascent, and Margaret moved with the careful deliberation of someone who had given her body to difficult work. By the time she reached the cottage, darkness had fallen completely, and she was exhausted in a way that seemed to encompass not just physical fatigue, but something deeper, the exhaustion that comes from crossing a threshold, from acknowledging that the life she had been living had fundamentally changed. She rebuilt the fire, prepared a simple meal, and sat alone in the cottage for the first time since Oswin's arrival more than a year before. The space seemed larger now, emptier in a way that had nothing to do with physical dimensions. She was aware of his absence in every corner, the bench where he had sat, the sleeping space where he had rested, the place at the table where he had written in the village records. But she was also aware of his presence, in the work they had completed together, in the knowledge she had absorbed from him, in the understanding she had developed about what it meant to tend a place, to bear witness, to transform abandonment into something meaningful. That night, Margaret slept poorly, her dreams filled with images of mountains and villages, and people moving through spaces that seemed both familiar and strange. She woke several times in the darkness, reaching for comfort in the thought that the work would continue, that what she and Oswin had begun together would persist through her efforts, that the village would not be forgotten. By morning, Margaret understood what she needed to do. She brought out the village record book and opened it to the last page Oswin had written in. Then, taking up pen and ink with her work-reddened hands, she began to document what had occurred. Oswin, 73 years old, passed from this life into eternal rest on the evening of the summer solstice, she wrote. He came to the village in winter when the snow lay deep and the cold was absolute, seeking shelter and community. He found both. Together, we restored the buildings that had been abandoned, maintained the gardens, and prepared medicines for future needs. Together, we understood that a village is not measured by population, but by presence, not by permanence, but by the choices made to remain and witness. Oswin has been placed in the ossuary on the mountainside, joining the generations who came before. The work continues. She paused, her pen hovering above the page, and then she added one final line. He left behind a healer trained in his knowledge, a village tended by intention, a record that will persist. He left behind love expressed through daily care. In the days that followed, Margaret began the work of organizing what Oswin had left behind. His correspondence with his daughter, the letters he had written but perhaps never sent, the careful documentation he had created, all of it found its place in the cottage, preserved carefully, held in readiness for whatever future might bring. She also began a new practice. Each evening, as the light faded, she would walk through the village and speak aloud about the people who had lived there, using the knowledge Oswin had shared, ensuring that their names and stories remained alive in the world even though their bodies had departed. Elena the baker lived in the cottage near the center, she would say, standing in the square where she and Oswin had celebrated the summer. She made bread that carried memory in every bite. Her hands were always flour-dusted. She died here in her cottage, having lived a life of beauty and nourishment. And as she spoke these remembrances, Margaret understood that she was doing the work Oswin had begun, was carrying forward the understanding that places and people mattered, that witness was a form of love, that some things were worth preserving even when the world moved on. The summer continued its progression, and Margaret found herself settling into a rhythm that was different from the rhythm she had shared with Oswin, but that carried forward the essential work they had begun together. She tended the gardens, maintained the medicines, cared for the cottages, and documented everything in the village records, not just practical information but the texture of experience, the quality of light in different seasons, the sounds of wind in the mountains, the particular smell of herbs drying in the cottage. One afternoon, as she was gathering herbs in the high garden that Catherine had established, Margaret found something she had not seen before, a small carved stone, barely visible beneath moss and thyme, bearing marks that suggested it had been deliberately placed. She carefully cleared away the growth and discovered an inscription in a script so old it took her time to decipher it. For those who come after, it read, "Remember that this place has been tended. Remember that we remained. Remember that love persists through care." Margaret sat back on her heels, her work-reddened hands trembling slightly, and she understood that she was not the first person to choose to remain, not the first person to understand that a place could be preserved through presence and intention. She was part of a lineage stretching back through time, connected to people whose names she would never know but whose work had made her own work possible. That evening, she carved her own message on a stone and placed it carefully in the garden, near Catherine's ancient marker. Margaret and Oswin tended this place with care, she wrote. We kept the fire burning. We maintained the knowledge. We refused erasure. For whoever comes next, the mountains hold memory. The village persists. Continue the work. Autumn arrived that year with a poignancy that Margaret had not fully anticipated. The mountains turned colors that seemed to belong to memory rather than to nature. Deep golds and purples and shades of rust that reminded her of Oswin's face in certain lights, of the color of dried herbs hanging from the cottage beams, of the particular quality of light that existed only in the high places. Margaret, 32 years old, moved through the village with a different quality of presence than she had known before. She was no longer simply tending. She was witnessing, documenting, preserving. Each day brought new awareness of what had been lost and what persisted, what had been forgotten and what remained. She began to develop a practice of maintenance that went beyond the practical. Each morning, she would walk through the village and touch the stone walls of the cottages, acknowledging them, ensuring they knew they were remembered. She would speak the names of the people who had lived in each building, using the knowledge Oswin had given her, insisting that their stories remained alive. Here lived Thomas the smith, she would say, running her work-reddened hands across the stone of his workshop. He made horseshoes that never broke, tools that held their edge. He had 3 children who left to seek their fortunes in the city. He died here in this place, having created beauty from metal. One morning, as Margaret was tending the herb garden, she discovered evidence that something had changed in the village. A path in the snow, for an early autumn snowfall had come overnight, showed footprints that were not hers and not Oswin's. The tracks led from the mountain pass down toward the village center, suggesting that someone had walked through the settlement and departed again. Margaret followed the footprints carefully, understanding that they represented a boundary being crossed, that the village's isolation had been breached. The tracks entered several cottages and exited again, suggesting that whoever had come had been exploring, investigating, perhaps seeking shelter or supplies. She found evidence in the baker's cottage, a place where someone had sat by the cold hearth, where items had been moved and then replaced, where human presence had briefly occupied the space. Margaret sat on the bench where the mysterious visitor had rested and tried to imagine who they might have been, what had brought them to this high place, whether they would return. That evening, she documented the discovery in the village records, understanding that this incident represented something significant, the possibility that others might find their way here, that the village's sealed isolation was not permanent, that the future she and Oswin had prepared for might actually arrive. As the days progressed, Margaret began to make preparations for the possibility of visitors. She ensured that several cottages were in good repair and could provide shelter. She stocked the larger of the village buildings with supplies, dried herbs, preserved vegetables, firewood, understanding that hospitality was part of the work of maintaining a place, that welcoming strangers was a form of witness. She also began to think about what knowledge she might need to share if people did return. Not just the practical information about surviving in the mountains, but the deeper understanding that Oswin had taught her, that a place could be sacred, that witness mattered, that small communities could create meaning just as large ones could. Winter came early that year, arriving with a fierceness that reminded Margaret of the winter when Oswin had appeared at her door. The snow accumulated rapidly, and the temperatures dropped to levels that required constant fire management and careful conservation of resources. But Margaret had learned the rhythms now, understood what was necessary, moved through the season with the confidence of someone who had survived it before and knew she could survive it again. During the long nights, Margaret continued the work of documentation. She wrote in the village records, expanding on the notes Oswin had left, adding her own observations about the seasons, about the work of maintaining the village, about the particular quality of life in a high mountain place. She also began to write letters to Oswin's daughter in the city, to anyone she could imagine might eventually find their way back to the village. "Your father taught me that a village is not about buildings or population," she wrote to Oswin's daughter. "It is about presence and intention and the refusal to let what mattered be forgotten. I am continuing his work. I am tending to the place where you grew up, the place where your father chose to remain. If you ever wish to return, you will find it ready, not unchanged, but tended, remembered, held in care." As spring approached and the snow began to recede, Margaret made an expedition to the high pass where the footprints had originally entered the village. She carried supplies and a message written on carefully prepared parchment, understanding that if someone came seeking the village, they should know that it was inhabited, that there was someone here to offer shelter and knowledge. She found a sheltered spot and created a marker, stones arranged to direct travelers, and a small shelter where she left supplies and her written message. The work felt both hopeful and uncertain, an offering made to an unknown future, a prayer expressed through practical action. That summer was different from the previous summer, marked by a quality of waiting. Margaret continued her work, maintaining the gardens, tending the medicines, repairing buildings. But there was also a kind of readiness in her movements, an awareness that something was shifting, that the village's long isolation might be approaching its end. One afternoon, when the light fell particularly clear through the mountains, and the air carried the scent of herbs in full bloom, Margaret received a visitor. She was in the garden when she first sensed the presence, not through sight or sound, but through a kind of awareness that the mountains seemed to communicate, a subtle shift in the quality of attention that surrounded the village. She looked up to find a young woman standing at the edge of the garden, perhaps 20 years old, with a face that held a familiar quality, features that seemed to echo something Margaret recognized, though she was certain she had never seen this person before. "I am Elena," the young woman said. Her voice carried the accent of the city, but also something of the mountains in its undertones. "My grandmother was the baker. My grandfather, Oswin, passed away while I was in the city, and my mother could not return in time. But I came. I came to see the place where my family lived, where my grandfather chose to remain." Margaret felt something shift in her chest, a kind of completion and continuation happening simultaneously. "Your grandfather was an extraordinary man," she said, moving toward the young woman with work-reddened hands extended in greeting. He came to me in winter, seeking shelter, and instead we created something beautiful together. He told me stories about your grandmother, about the baker's cottage, about the generations that lived here. Come, let me show you what we have preserved. Over the following days, Margaret guided Elena through the village, sharing the knowledge that Oswin had given her, showing her the cottage where her grandmother had baked, the cottage where her grandfather had lived, the places where the family's history was written into stone and soil and memory. Elena moved through the village with wonder and a kind of reverent grief, understanding in a way that only direct descendants could bring that this place held her own history, that the work Margaret was doing was preserving the foundation of her own existence. My mother said she could not bear to return, Elena confessed one evening as they sat by the fire in Margaret's cottage. The loss was too great, leaving the village, leaving my grandfather, knowing that this place was being left behind. But I understand now what my grandfather understood. That loss does not erase significance. Those places and people can persist through memory and care. That someone staying matters. Elena remained through the summer, learning from Margaret, helping with the work of maintaining the village and gardens, and understanding the knowledge that the healer carried. She helped Margaret document the stories that Oswin had shared, creating a more complete record of the village's history, ensuring that the knowledge would persist not just in Margaret's memory, but in written form that could be transmitted to future generations. As autumn approached and Elena began to make preparations to return to the city, she and Margaret made an agreement. Elena would document her family's history, would gather stories from her mother and other family members who had departed from the village, and would return the following summer to add that knowledge to the village records. I cannot leave the city permanently, Elena explained, her young face serious with understanding. I have responsibilities there, people who depend on me, but I can return each summer. I can help maintain the knowledge. I can ensure that the village's story continues to be told. Margaret embraced her as she prepared to depart, understanding that this was how the future would unfold, not through the return of large populations, but through intermittent visitors, through people who carried the village's history in their bodies and memories, through a network of connection that spanned the distance between the mountains and the valleys below. That winter was Margaret's second winter alone, but it felt different from the anticipatory loneliness of the winter before Oswin arrived. She carried within her the knowledge that others would return, that the village was no longer entirely isolated, that the work she was doing was creating bridges between the abandoned place and the living world below. She continued her documentation, expanded the gardens, maintained the cottages, and prepared the village for the possibility of future visitors. She also began to understand that her role was not static. It would evolve as the village evolved, as more people discovered it, as the knowledge transmitted by Oswin and Catherine and the generations before them continued to flow forward through time. One evening, as snow fell outside the cottage and the fire burned steadily, Margaret took up pen and wrote a new entry in the village records, not just documentation of facts, but reflection on the meaning of the work she was doing. I have come to understand that a village is not defined by the number of people who live in it at any given moment. It is defined by the commitment to remember, to preserve, to welcome those who return seeking connection to what came before. Oswin taught me this. The mountains teach me this. Elena's return teaches me this. The work continues, not despite the village's emptiness, but because of it, because that emptiness creates space for intention, for care, for the insistence that what mattered persists. I am 32 years old. I may tend this village for decades to come. I may train others in the knowledge of herbs and healing. I may welcome back the children and grandchildren of those who departed. Or I may be succeeded by someone else, someone drawn by the work, by the knowledge, by the particular beauty of a high mountain place that has been preserved through love and attention. Whatever comes, the village will endure, not unchanged but tended, not full but never entirely empty, a place where people can return to know themselves, to understand their history, to reconnect with the earth that shaped their ancestors. That is enough. That is everything. Margaret set down her pen and looked around the cottage, at the herbs hanging from beams, at the medicines waiting on shelves, at the fire burning steadily in the hearth. She thought of Catherine, who had come before her and established the foundation. She thought of Oswin, who had returned and helped her understand the significance of what she was doing. She thought of Elena, who would return and help carry the work forward. Outside, the mountains held the village in their eternal embrace, and the snow continued its patient work of covering, preserving, transforming everything it touched into something beautiful and new. As the winter deepened and the snow continued its patient work across the mountains, Margaret settled into the rhythm of solitude that was no longer entirely lonely. The cottage held within it the presence of those who had come before, Catherine with her careful knowledge, Oswin with his stories and witness, Elena with her return and promise. The fire burned steadily through the long nights, tended by hands that had learned the particular care required in high mountain places. The herbs hung from the beams in their careful bundles, waiting to serve whoever might need healing. The village records rested on their shelf, holding the history of generations, ready for future additions, future voices, future witnesses. Margaret, 32 years old, moved through her days with a deep sense of purpose. She prepared medicines not knowing who would receive them, but trusting that the knowledge would find its way to those who needed it. She maintained the cottages not for inhabitants that were present, but for inhabitants that might return. She tended the gardens understanding that growth itself was a form of remembrance. One particularly clear morning, when the snow sparkled like diamonds under morning sun, and the mountains seemed close enough to touch, Margaret stood at the highest point above the village and looked down at what had been created through intention and care. The stone cottages rested peacefully beneath their blankets of snow. The church tower pointed toward the sky. The paths through the village, marked by her own footsteps and Oswin's and Elena's, created a network of connection that refused to disappear entirely. The gardens, dormant now beneath the cold, held within them the memory of growth and the promise of spring's return. She thought of the 417 people who had departed, carrying with them the village's future possibility. She held no judgment toward them. They had done what they needed to do to survive, to give their children opportunities, to build lives in places where the seasons were gentler and the community larger. But she also understood deeply, in a way that only solitude could teach, that she and Oswin and Catherine before her had done something equally necessary. They had said yes to the mountains. They had said yes to the witness. They had said yes to the particular kind of courage required to remain when everyone else departed, to insist that a place mattered, that memory was worth preserving, that love could be expressed through daily care. The village would not be what it had been. 400 people would not return to walk its streets and fill its cottages and create the particular kind of community that only large populations could create. But it would be something quieter, perhaps more profound, something that spoke to the truth that meaning could be found in small things, that significance did not require scale, that a single person tending a place with intention could transform abandonment into something sacred. Margaret descended the mountainside slowly, her breath forming small clouds in the cold air. She walked through the village one final time before returning to the cottage, touching the stones of buildings, acknowledging the people who had lived within them, speaking their names into the silence so that they would not be entirely forgotten. When she reached the cottage, she found that the fire had burned low but held enough coals to revive. She fed it carefully, adding wood with the practiced precision of someone who understood fire as both necessity and companion. The flames rose, and warmth began to spread through the small space once more. She prepared a simple evening meal, bread and cheese and a cup of herb tea, the same meal she had eaten countless times, the same meal that sustained her, the same meal that seemed to hold within it the entire history of human survival and persistence. As darkness fell and the mountains settled into their deep night silence, Margaret sat by the fire and felt a profound sense of peace. Not the absence of difficulty or challenge, but the presence of meaning-making. Not the illusion of permanence, but the acceptance of impermanence joined with the commitment to continue anyway. Tomorrow will bring new work. Spring would eventually arrive again with its demands and possibilities. Elena would return, and perhaps others with her. The village would continue to evolve, to transform, to be shaped by the hands and hearts of those who chose to remain or return. But tonight, in this quiet moment, Margaret understood that she had found what she came to the mountains seeking, what Catherine had taught her to understand, what Oswin had helped her fully accept, that a single life, lived with intention and care, could matter. That witness was a form of love. That remaining was a kind of courage. The fire crackled softly, releasing sparks that rose toward the darkness and faded like small stars returning home. Outside, the mountains held the village in their eternal embrace, holding all the stories that had ever been lived here, all the people who had ever walked these paths, all the love that had been expressed through daily work and attention. And within that embrace, a healer sat by her fire, her work-reddened hands folded peacefully in her lap, her dark hair catching the firelight, her heart full of the knowledge that some things, some people, some places, some stories, were worth preserving, worth tending, worth the commitment to remain and remember. The mountains would endure. The seasons would turn. The village would persist, not in its former fullness, but in its essential truth, tended by those who understood that love persists through care, That witness transforms abandonment into something beautiful. That remaining matters. And Margaret, 32 years old, settled into the peace of knowing that she had found her place in the world, that her life had purpose, that the work would continue long after her own time came to its gentle conclusion. The fire burned on through the long mountain night, a small flame holding back the darkness, a beacon of intention and care in a high place where people had chosen to remember, to witness, to love.